I'm Bennett Helm for the project on Love and Human Agency, and I'm interviewing Jorge Moll, who is the head of the Cognitive and Behavioral Neuroscience Unit and Neural Informatics Work Group at the Door Institute for Research and Education in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. So, Jorge, can you tell us a little bit about your background? What got you interested in neuroscience in general and moral behavior and motivation in particular?
Initially, before entering medical school, I was deeply interested in human mind. I was interested about consciousness, about how everything began. I was very interested in astronomy. So the mystery of our existence is something that always interested me very much. So I entered medical school aiming to learn about the brain. I eventually got into neurology, but before going into neurology as a specialty, I was very interested in imaging. So MRI was out there pretty much. The PET studies showing brain activity related to certain cognitive functions. The studies were at the time coming out, and I was very interested in that. It was around 1995 and 96 that I had access to an MRI scanner, and then I started actually pretty much alone, trying to get functional images from the brain.
Now, what is an MRI scanner, and how is that different from an fMRI scanner?
So basically, an MRI equipment is an equipment which is capable of getting pretty good information about the anatomy, the structure of your brain. It's able to generate high quality images of your brain. In 91, 92, around that time, some researchers developed this technique called fMRI, functional MRI. So this technique actually caused we could call a revolution in neuroscience, because it allowed researchers to test a number of hypotheses how about the brain function, how about the brain responds to a number of different stimuli in a non-invasive way, without using radioactive markers and etc. So fMRI started a whole new era into the human brain sciences. So it was around that time, back in Brazil, 96, I was able to get my first fMRI images of the brain, using very simple type of experiments, like stimulating the skin and looking at the sensory cortex, doing some motor experiments, finger tapping, doing some imagined movements. That took my interest. You know, it was a lot about methodology, how to obtain those images from the brain, from the working brain. And I think it was a natural development that I got interested in the more mysterious functions of the brain. At the time I met my close friend and collaborator Ricardo de Oliveira Souza. He's also a neurologist, but with a strong focus on behavioral neurology, frontal lobe functions, and psychiatry as well. So we met in '98, and then we started to develop together a program on trying to get to study the so-called higher functions of the brain. In '98, '99, we collected our first brain images while people made moral judgments. So at the time, the sophistication of the designs were not so much as we see today. So we did our first experiments in showing that the frontal lobes, the most anterior part of the frontal lobes, are robustly activated when people make moral judgments internally.
So what tell us a little bit about the design of those experiments. How did you get those results?
So our first attempt was just to provide people in the scanner to throw statements, to present these statements to them auditorily. So we had statements with moral content. For example, they hung an innocent man, and we compared those statements to statements that describe factual knowledge. For example, telephones never ring. So people in the scanner, they had to mentally judge if that was right or wrong, and we could compare right or wrong judgments from in the moral condition compared to the factual condition.
And how does that tell you what parts of the brain are active when people are making moral judgments?
So basically, of course, this type of design was a primitive one, but it was a first attempt to discriminate brain patterns related to moral judgments or as compared to judgments of fact. It's fun to remember that at the time we got these expected responses in the frontal lobes, because there was a lot of evidence already for the role of the frontal lobes in moral behavior, in social behavior in general, in moral behavior more specifically, because some patients with prefrontal lesions developed social impairments, impairments in their social behaviors.
So a prefrontal lesion would be damage to that part of the brain.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So the prefrontal cortex is this more anterior part of the frontal cortex. So the posterior parts up here, they are more motor related. They control movements, and they are also important for the planning of movements. The prefrontal regions have a number of different functions, including planning, including executive control, controlling about behaviors, and more recently, and that's part of the experiments we've been doing, they appear to be also involved in the representation of high-level emotions, so-called moral emotions, such as guilt, compassion. So the prefrontal cortex seems to have an important role in enabling us to experience those sophisticated emotions.
Okay.
It's also very crucial for decision making, because for decision making you need to think about the consequences of your choices and whether the consequences are good or bad. You have to balance, you have to weight different types of consequences, and you have to weigh the benefits and costs of decisions. So the prefrontal cortex, while being integrated with subcortical regions which are at the bottom of our brain, considered to be old regions of the brain, and also with the temporal cortex, which lies just here. The integration of the frontal cortex function with these subcortical temporal regions and some posterior regions is crucially important to enable us to experience certain types of feelings and to make decisions and other types of functions like that.
Let me come back to those early experiments that you were doing. So you were comparing the activation of particular parts of the brain when people were getting, hearing moral statements to what was going on in their brain when they were hearing non-moral statements. And you were looking at the differences in the patterns of activation between those two types of states. Is that right?
That's right.
Why do you characterize those early experiments as relatively crude, early initial attempts? How have you become more sophisticated?
That's a good question. I'll give an example. So our first study did not control, for example, for the degree of emotionality of the stimuli, of the statements. And so that's a variable that should be controlled. Okay. So if you compare statements like they hung an innocent man, compared to telephone's narrow ring, the example I just gave before, clearly they have differences in terms of the degree of emotional contents. Therefore, if we find differences in brain activation between these two conditions, we can attribute that just for the emotional impact of the statements, not necessarily the moral salience of the statements. For that reason, we did a number of experiments subsequently, which aim to balance, to control for the level of emotional experience. So we did further experiments having statements which were emotional in nature, but they didn't have high moral contents or moral salience. They did not involve, for example, violations of social norms or values. That's how we defined a statement as being morally relevant. And we got pretty much the same picture in the brain. So not only the prefrontal cortex, the anterior prefrontal cortex, we call the frontal polar cortex here, but also the anterior temporal cortex being more active for moral judgments. So a next question after that was regarding whether we got these frontal activations because of the explicit nature of the judgments. So people had to judge situations explicitly. Oh, this is a moral judgment, so I judge this. So we did an experiment in which we presented, instead of statements, we presented a number of pictures, emotional pictures, and also non-emotional pictures. So there were two main categories of pictures. Some of them, which were rated beforehand as highly morally salient, so pictures that depicted violations, right? Aggression, war, scenes like that. And other sets of pictures which were also negative, emotionally speaking, but they did not have emotional salience in itself. So accidents, dangerous animals, situations like that. So the first comparison we did with functional MRI across these conditions was to look at the brain and look what is common to these two sets of pictures, two sets of negative, emotionally negative pictures, the moral ones and the non-moral ones. And if we look what we call a conjunction analysis, so which regions are more active when we look at the negative pictures comparing to emotionally neutral pictures, we get a picture which shows the regions that have been implicated in general in aversive feelings, including the amygdala. Okay, but the most interesting comparison is actually comparing the moral pictures to the non-moral negative pictures. And it's important to emphasize that participants, they were not aware about the moral nature of the study. So we just told them that they would see a number of pictures. Some of them would be emotionally strong, negative. Others would not be. They just have to pay attention to the pictures. Okay, so when we compare the moral to the negative, non-moral pictures, we got pretty much the same pattern of activation of the brain as for moral judgments, for explicit moral judgments. And that was very telling because at the time the frontal lobe function was assumed to be, very linked to executive processes in themselves, not necessarily to the experience as a passive condition. So although we cannot be absolutely sure that people are not implicitly making some kinds of judgments, it's already interesting to see that we get these anterior prefrontal cortex responses and anterior temporal responses when people simply pay attention to morally salient pictures.
And is this what got you interested in moral emotions in particular?
Yeah, that study was a key study because we got ratings afterwards from participants and on which emotions they experience when seeing those pictures. And it became clear for us that these pictures differed in terms of the emotions they elicited, the emotions that were evoked by looking at these pictures. Typically, the morally salient pictures evoked indignation, because there were like scenes of injustice and things like that, or they evoked compassion, observing suffering people suffering from a number of situations. Whereas the non-moral pictures, in general, they evoked feelings of unpleasantness, more linked to anger or to fear. Actually, not so anger, because it was a passive presentation. It was more fear and disgust, basically. So we could really see that the morally salient pictures, they evoked more what we call moral emotions, compassion, indignation, so emotions which are evoked if you care about something, and not only are your own well-being, for example.
So you could see the differences between the moral emotions and the non-moral emotions in terms of what areas of the brain were activated.
Exactly. So there was a kind of overlap between the brain regions which respond when we were making moral judgments as compared with regions which are activated when you just watch scenes which are morally salient and thereby evoke moral emotions such as indignation and compassion.
And this kind of research has led you to develop the event feature emotion complex model.
So
can you tell us about that model and what it tries to explain and how it does that?
So at the time, there were a number of studies were being produced, in the coming years, since the 2001, 2002, and so on. A number of studies were produced. In general, what they showed was a remarkable picture, which was, despite a huge variation of the type of judgments people used, complex judgments, simple judgments, or if it used a passive design, just morally salient pictures, situations, or if they were using visual materials or verbal materials or film clips. Interestingly, despite all this variation, if you look across studies, there was a reliable activation of a number of regions, which we now understand that there are different regions that code for moral salience. It's not only social salience, not just because there are faces and because there is body movement. It's more than that. Which that led us to try to formulate a model which could be used to accommodate the possible functions of the different brain regions, which were consistently involved across studies, and so that led us to formulate the affect model, which is the event feature emotion complex model. So basically, that model emerged from the body of evidence we got from functional imaging studies and from a wide reading of the lesion literature. It is important to emphasize that what we see in functional imaging studies is not necessarily the regions which are necessary for a given cognitive emotional function. Fmri tells more about the regions which are involved or associated or maybe sufficient for that functions, but not the necessary ones. For that reason, we recurred to the lesion studies. So we did a pretty thorough job of looking at the lesion literature There was a lot of scattered evidence out there, and putting together all these lines of evidence together with the functional imaging evidence, we could come up with a simplified model of moral cognition. So
with the lesion evidence, you find somebody who has damage to a particular portion of the brain, and you find also that that person has certain kinds of cognitive, affective, behavioral deficits, and so you infer that this region of the brain that is damaged is a region that is necessary for normal functioning in that area.
That's exactly the case.
Can you give some examples of that?
I'll give some examples. By the end of the 90s, most studies were focused on the role of the frontal lobes in social behavior. But if you go to the literature, the lesion literature, you find a number of reports of patients who had lesions in different parts of the brain. It's not all over the brain, but specific parts of the brain, which in turn developed social dysfunctions. So, in addition to looking at the Fmri evidence, we carefully looked at the case studies in which patients developed impairments of social behavior following focal lesions. So we can tell that the main regions of the brain which consistently lead to social behavioral dysfunctions can be separated in three big groups. So the frontal cortical lesions, especially the most anterior part of the frontal lobes and the ventral part, so-called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Also the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, less consistently but still associated with impairments in social behavior. The second big part of the brain involved in social behavior in lesion studies are the anterior temporal lobes. So especially the right anterior temporal lobe. We have lots of evidence now, especially in patients suffering trauma and patients with frontal temporal lobe degeneration. So they have atrophy in these regions. And we know that patients developing atrophy mainly to the right anterior temporal cortex, they can develop very severe changes in personality and social behavior, etc. Finally, lesions in deep parts of the brain, such as the basal forebrain, hypothalamus, amygdala, and the septal region, which are back, at the base of the brain here. These lesions are often fatal because they are involved in homeostatic control and functions like that, sleep-wake cycles. But if lesions are small and capricious, very small lesions like a millimeter lesion can lead to very severe changes in personality as well. Can lead to overtly aggressive behavior, can lead to changes in sexual orientation and a number of different changes in motivation and emotion. So that was our starting point to build the affect model. So it's actually putting, bringing the knowledge we have already from the functions of different parts of the brain, but looking within the perspective of why those functions are important for moral behavior. And now, in gathering evidence from the lesion studies and from the functional imaging studies to try to build a more consistent or intelligible model of what can we expect from lesions in specific regions of the brain in terms of behavioral impairments.
So this is a way of connecting cognitive parts of the brain with emotional parts of the brain and trying to understand how these are centrally important for motivation in general and moral motivation in particular.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. So one part of the story that is important too is looking at the evolution of the brain. So there is a temptation which comes since the ancient times to separate willful actions from emotional behaviors. So in terms of the rational brain and the limbic animal brain, so to say. And that's a view which found some support from models in the 20th century which saw the brain as a layered structure. So the limbic structure which we share with reptiles, and then another layer which we share with other mammals, which correspond to the emotions, and then the cortical sophisticated layer, which is the seat of reason. Okay, that's, in crude terms, one could think, or one could do a caricature, a picture of a cartoon version of the brain, of the emotional brain as such. But that doesn't appear to be, that layered model of the brain doesn't find strong support from evolution and also from human anatomy. That's because, let's give an example, the septal nuclei, which are very primitive nuclei in between the hemispheres of the brain and the anterior part, they're considered to be old structures, right, that we share with several mammals. But in no way they are like residual structures which were overcome, which were replaced by more novel structures such as the frontal cortex. And this is because there is good evidence that these nuclei, they grew with evolution. They are much larger in our species, for example, as compared to other primate species. So evolutionarily speaking, subcortical structures of the brain, they evolved together with the cortical structures in networks. So that's how we see the social brain. So it's a brain that evolves together. So the frontal, temporal structures, they are highly developed in our species, but so are also certain subcortical structures which grew hand in hand. And it's actually this radial arrangement of networks in the brain that can better explain the integration of high reason or higher cognitive abilities as integrated with emotional and feeling states.
So the innovative, the controversial aspect of your work here is in trying to connect an understanding of the cognitive portions of the brain, well, what might be thought the simply cognitive portions of the brain with what might be thought the simply emotional portions of the brain, to see these as an integrated whole, and this.
That's exactly the case. Okay. Intuitively, it's very tempting to think that we have crude emotions that emerge and they are uncontrollable, and then we have our rational states, cold and very clear-minded states. But it could be that I accept that in certain situations we can have a burst of emotions which overcome your reason. That's true. But for most of the time, these structures are working hand in hand. They are cooperating. So motivated behaviors actually, they arise by a fine integration and competition actually between different motivations. So we can think about different types of motivations which can be more or less sophisticated, but competing with each other when we try to make a decision. Should I do this, or should I do that, where we integrate motivations with high cognition, with prospective thinking, evaluation of outcomes, with memory, and so on.
In your more recent work, you've been focused on what you call affiliation. Tell us about what that affiliation, what you mean by affiliation, and how that connects to this understanding of moral emotions and moral behavior, and also, how is that different from what other people are doing?
Yeah. Okay. So because we were very interested in social behaviors, and we started to study which are the brain correlates of specific moral emotions such as compassion, guilt, indignation. We were interested to see if there were specific signatures in the brain for these different types of sophisticated emotions. The first lesson we learned is that we know from scattered studies looking at brain lesions in these deep regions of the brain, so the septal area, that patients can develop severe antisocial behavior, and they can lack empathy, for example. They don't manifest any signs of caring for others. They can be callous and etc. We have a developmental case of psychopathy. Although it's not clear that psychopathy has a problem in the development of those specific regions. That's something which needs to be studied. But nevertheless, it seems that there are no specific brain regions which are tied to specific emotions. It's actually probably a combinatorial thing, combinatorial issue. So, but we do find certain commonalities across emotions. So I'll give one example. If you think about emotions that we call prosocial emotions, that includes guilt, compassion, and embarrassment. So we can call them prosocial. That's debatable, but we can call prosocial emotions by considering that all of them in general prescribe or they encourage people to behave in a socially appropriate manner. So to avoid hurting other people or to avoid violating social norms. And if you look at these three emotions, for example, we did some experiments on that. We showed that the frontopolar cortex, that very same region we find for moral judgments, is robustly activated across these three emotions. So it doesn't seem to differentiate between them, among them. However, if you look at subcortical structures, such as the septal region, only guilt and compassion seem to strongly recruit that region, not embarrassment. So it's already telling. So actually that was a starting point for us to start to think of components in our brains, anatomical, functional components, which could help resolve why certain behaviors are enhanced or are suppressed when you have lesions in these regions. We hypothesized that there are certain neurocognitive components in the brain which could be more tied to our capacity to empathize or to care for other people.
So you're looking at the differences between guilt and compassion on the one hand and embarrassment on the other, finding that one central difference neurophysiologically is that guilt and compassion activate the septal region deep in the brain, whereas embarrassment does not. And so part of the thought here is that the difference between guilt and compassion on the one hand and embarrassment on the other is that guilt and compassion involve this sort of caring for others, and so that septal region must involve must be involved in that ability to care about others. And again, you find the lesion studies in which you get damage to the septal region, particular parts of it, which give rise to the inability to care about others.
So that's exactly the case. Guilt and compassion, they share this component because both require that we care for other people. You know, I feel guilt because I hurt someone. I hurt someone that I care for. I feel compassion because I'm suffering together with someone who is suffering. And embarrassment or shame do not seem to involve those components because you're caring about yourself, your own reputation. So that was an initial window for us to start to think, so there might be certain circuits in the brain that code for this caring state. So how you to what degree you're connected to other people, to what degree you would feel bad because someone is suffering or because you caused the suffering of someone, as opposed to just looking at the regions of the brain as coding for positive or negative emotional states. That was actually a starting point for us to start to delineate or to develop certain approaches to look at attachment-related responses. We've been calling that affiliative responses because if you adopt a very particular case of attachment, which is being attached to your family, kids, parents. So we started to develop a study which probed people with situations involving people they cared for. And then we could control for positive or negative valence in these situations. In other words, positive or negative emotions, we could control for that, but then also control for the presence or absence of affiliation in the scenario. If you're dealing in hypothetical situations with people you care for, or in situations that also can have positive or negative outcomes, but only impact on your own well-being and not the well-being of others. So what these studies showed us is that basically we confirmed our hypothesis that the septal part of the brain is indeed engaged by affiliative components, attachment-related components, and that is true even for in negative situations. Some, a situation, for example, that you imagine your own kid being hurt in certain ways, or you imagine your kid having a successful outcome. And if you look at both across positive and negative situations, you see that these situations involving people you care for, they do induce higher activity in the septal part of the brain, and that is a rather new component in the big picture of human emotions.
So it's because this affiliative core area in the septal region of the brain is involved in both positive and negative valences, both positive and negative emotions, that you think affiliation itself is not an emotion.
Yes, so we think that attachment in itself is not an emotion, or affiliation more specifically. It's not an emotion in itself, but in embeds, it's like a potential capacity which is necessary for the experience of emotions which depend on affiliation. Going back to the case of compassion and guilt and warm glow, feeling good, feeling joyful because someone you like, you care for, is also happy. So if you look across these situations, there is this component of caring for someone. So that's exactly what we think is this brain-based capacity of being attached to someone, and by feeling attached to someone, you're then able to experience guilt or altruistic pride, altruistic joy, or a number of different emotions which depend on this affiliative component.
Now, other people have studied attachment as well, and studied attachment perhaps most famously in the prairie voles. What you're doing is different from what they've done. Can you characterize that difference?
Actually, the work done by Insel and Young on the prairie vole model was very inspiring for us. So they actually showed very elegantly that if you knock out receptors or the expression of certain neurotransmitters, basically vasopressin and oxytocin, and acting in certain subcortical regions of the brain, these animals, they can cease to have attachment or bonding behaviors. So for sure that kind of research was very key for our formulations. But at the same time, they were very distant because they were only animal models, and in humans it's very difficult to study receptors. We cannot do genetic knockouts and things like that. So for sure our research on the brain basis of attachment builds a lot on the evidence we had from animal models. The other limitation that we had, however, is that in animal models you cannot study subjective states. So it's very difficult to infer what these animals might be feeling. So as humans, we can obtain ratings and reports on what people feel in certain circumstances. On the top of that, as humans, we experience much more sophisticated emotions, guilt, for example, which we cannot test in animals. So I believe that building on this solid evidence from animals, from the bonding, and providing new evidence that brain circuits which were shown to be involved in, say, in other mammals in attachment mechanisms was a key thing. But it is not sufficient to know that these circuits were involved in bonding. So more recently we did this study, that was at the NIH some years ago, in which we tested whether the act of sacrificing your own financial resources to give to a cause you care for, if those types of decisions would involve responses, first on the brain reward system, and second on the brain attachment system, which is actually poorly characterized. So basically what we see in the brain is that when people donate to a cause they care for, they indeed activate the dopamine system of the brain, the so-called reward system of the brain. But most importantly, if you compare donating to causes to gaining money for yourself, while these two situations share activity in the brain reward system, only donating to causes leads to increased activity in this septal region of the brain, which now we think we have, I think, more evidence to suggest that it's a region that's very closely tied to affiliative feelings, feeling connected to both to your kids, personally attached to people, to your family, keen attachment, but also attached to highly abstract causes, principles, even ideologies, maybe even with sports teams.
So part of the idea is that this notion of affiliation is richer in part because it involves, a sense of connectedness with other people, right? Potentially involving moral emotions, involving that sense of community with others that probably is not going on in the case of the mere animal attachment that you might find in the prairie voles.
Yes, that is true. So showing that we engage our so-called primitive attachment system in situations which are highly complex, such attaching to feeling part of a social group, for example, is something that goes well beyond what we could derive simply from animal models. And another point that is raised in this situation is how we define principles, values, and how we characterize social groups. That's something that's very special to our species, and that's something we've been since we provided our model in 2005, we've been chasing for evidence of how the semantic or conceptual areas of the brain contribute to those kinds of behaviors and motivations. So my colleague Roland Zahn is now at the University of Manchester. He did a series of studies showing that this anterior part of the temporal lobe is very important in storing conceptual social knowledge. So the knowledge of abstract concepts such as generals, brave, and so on, stingy. These kinds of semantic or conceptual knowledge are very important. They allow us to make very quick and efficient judgments in social situations because they encapsulate very specific knowledge about social behaviors. So that's one part of our cognitive system which is, I would say, very particular to humans. So the ability to feel connected to others provided by our say attachment systems or bonding systems in the brain, the septal area and other neighboring areas of the limbic brain. Having that and being able to flexibly construct groups of attributes, let's say social concepts to social groups, or even to parties, political parties, and so on. This allows us to develop very strong preferences for certain types of social groups which we share values with, and to antagonize other social groups that we disagree with.
So part of what this is showing, like with the event feature emotion complex model, is that you have an integration between the more evolutionarily recent cognitive portions of the brain, the cortex, and the more evolutionarily older portions of the brain, the septal region, involving emotions and that sort of thing. These are integrated together, and it's that integration which sort of transforms what you might think of as a primitive sort of attachment that you might find in animals to the richer, more complex, potentially moral affiliation that you find distinctive of people.
That is exactly the case. So it's actually the integration of this so-called new regions, cortical regions of the brain, with the so-called old parts of the brain, which again are not old in that sense because they also evolved hand in hand with the cortical systems. But it's exactly this integration that we think makes us humans.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us.
Thank you.